Let's get started. Story number 1.
The decision to go off the grid wasn't entirely voluntary for Emily. After a bitter divorce and the loss of her job, she needed time away from everything: people, technology, expectations. Her friend Claire suggested the cabin, an isolated spot deep in the Rockies, far from the demands of the world. Claire had stayed there once, describing it as rustic but peaceful. Emily latched onto the idea and packed up her SUV for a week of solitude. The drive took her through winding mountain roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. Cell service vanished hours before she reached the cabin, leaving her alone with the sound of her tires crunching gravel. When she finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as Claire had described: a weathered wooden structure nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp leaves. The cabin had no electricity, but it did have a wood-burning stove, a well for water, and enough provisions to last a week. Emily felt the tension in her shoulders ease as she unpacked her bags. This was what she needed. The first 2 days passed peacefully. She spent her mornings hiking the trails around the cabin and her evenings reading by the light of a kerosene lantern. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush or the distant call of an owl. It was almost too quiet at times, but Emily convinced herself that was part of the charm. It was on the third night that things began to feel wrong. Emily was sitting on the porch, sipping tea and watching the stars, when she heard it, a faint sound like someone walking through the woods. The noise came from the tree line, just beyond the clearing. She froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the skittering of an animal or the snap of a single branch. It was deliberate, measured footsteps crunching on dry leaves. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The footsteps stopped. Emily stood, her heartbeat quickening. She shone her flashlight toward the trees, but the beam revealed nothing but shadows and dense foliage. She stayed on the porch for another hour, her nerves on edge, before retreating inside and bolting the door. She told herself it was probably a deer, or maybe even her imagination. The woods could play tricks on you when you were alone. But the next morning, she found something that chilled her. Near the edge of the clearing, the soft earth was disturbed, the unmistakable impression of a footprint. It was human, large enough to belong to a man, and fresh. Emily stared at it for a long time, trying to convince herself it was hers from the day before, though she knew it wasn't. She spent the day close to the cabin, keeping a hatchet within reach as she gathered firewood and checked her water supply. The sense of peace she'd felt when she arrived was gone, replaced by an uneasy awareness of every sound, every shifting shadow. That night, the footsteps returned. Emily was lying in bed, the cabin dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire, when she heard them. This time, they circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, her ears straining. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. She waited, her heart pounding, but nothing happened. No knock, no voice, no attempt to enter. After what felt like an eternity, the steps moved away, fading into the forest. The next morning, Emily debated leaving. She'd told no one exactly where she was going. Part of the appeal was being unreachable, but now that isolation felt like a mistake. Still, she convinced herself to stay one more night. She'd come here to prove she could handle being alone, and she didn't want to leave defeated. That afternoon, as she walked the perimeter of the clearing, she found something new. A small cairn, a pile of stones stacked neatly in the center of the trail leading away from the cabin. She hadn't seen it before, and it hadn't been there the day she arrived. The stones were smooth and rounded like river rocks, but there was no stream nearby. Emily crouched to inspect them, her unease deepening. As she reached out to touch the top stone, a sharp crack echoed through the woods, like a tree branch snapping. She spun around, but the trail was empty. The forest felt oppressive, the towering pines leaning in as if to block out the sun. She hurried back to the cabin, every nerve on edge. That night, the knocking began. It started as a faint tapping on the walls, like fingers brushing against the wood. Emily sat by the fire, clutching the hatchet, her pulse racing. The tapping moved around the cabin, from the walls to the windows to the door. She tried to tell herself it was an animal, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too human. Then came the voice. Low and guttural, it called her name. Emily. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice came again, closer this time. Emily, you shouldn't be here. She backed away from the door, her hands trembling. Who's out there? What do you want? There was no reply. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against her ears. Then, with a deafening crash, something slammed against the door. Emily screamed, stumbling backward. The door held, but the wood groaned under the force. Grabbing her flashlight and hatchet, she bolted out the back door and into the woods. The cold night air stung her face as she ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The forest closed in around her, branches snagging her clothes and scratching her skin. She could hear the footsteps behind her, heavy and fast, but every time she glanced back, the beam revealed nothing. Emily? The voice was closer now, echoing through the trees. You can't hide. She tripped over a root, falling hard onto the forest floor. The flashlight flew from her hand, its beam cutting out as it hit the ground. She scrambled to her feet, disoriented, and ran in the direction she hoped was the road. Finally, she saw it, the faint outline of her SUV through the trees. She stumbled into the clearing, yanked open the door, and climbed inside. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life. She didn't look back as she sped down the narrow road, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind her. It wasn't until she reached the safety of a motel hours later that she realized she still had the hatchet in her hand, her knuckles white from gripping it. She left it on the bedside table and locked every door and window before collapsing into an uneasy sleep. Emily never told anyone the full story of what happened at the cabin. When Claire asked how the trip went, she simply said, "It wasn't for me." She never went back to the Rockies, never ventured off the grid again. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, she swore she could still hear it. The faint sound of footsteps circling her, and a voice whispering her name. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The idea of going off the grid had always appealed to David. He was tired of the endless noise of city life. The blaring horns, the constant buzz of his phone, the emails that demanded immediate attention. So when he found an ad for a cabin rental in a secluded forest in Oregon, he jumped at the chance. The description promised peace, quiet, and a complete disconnect from the modern world. No electricity, no internet, and no phone service. Just a wood-burning stove, a stocked pantry, and miles of untouched wilderness. It sounded perfect. The drive out there, long, taking him down winding back roads that seemed to grow narrower with each turn. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. It was smaller than he'd imagined. A single room with a tiny porch surrounded by towering trees that cast long shadows across the clearing. The air was cool and still, and for the first time in years, David felt like he could breathe. He unloaded his supplies, lit the kerosene lantern on the table, and made himself a simple dinner. As night fell, the cabin grew dark, illuminated only by the flickering lantern and the glow of the wood stove. The first night was uneventful. David slept deeply, lulled by the quiet hum of crickets and the distant rustling of leaves. He woke with the sun, spent the day exploring the forest, and returned to the cabin with a bundle of firewood and a mind blissfully free of the usual distractions. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. David was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of tea and watching the stars when he heard it. A faint sound, almost like footsteps coming from the woods. He froze, straining his ears. It wasn't an animal. The rhythm was too deliberate, too human. "Hello," he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The footsteps stopped. David stood, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. After a few minutes, he shrugged it off. It was probably his imagination. The mind played tricks when you were alone in the woods. But later that night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again. The same deliberate steps, this time circling the cabin. He sat up, his heart pounding, and grabbed the lantern from the bedside table. Holding it up to the window, he scanned the clearing, but all he saw was darkness. The next morning, he searched the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and it didn't take long to find the footprints. They were human, unmistakably so, but something about them was strange. The steps were spaced too far apart, as if whoever made them had been leaping or running. David told himself it was probably a hiker or a hunter. The woods were vast. It wasn't impossible for someone else to be out here. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. That night, he locked the door and bolted the windows. He sat by the fire with a book, trying to distract himself, but every creak of the cabin made him jump. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They circled the cabin again and again, pausing at the windows and the door. David stood frozen, clutching the fireplace poker in one hand and the lantern in the other. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. There was no response. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from outside the door, a low, rasping voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." David's blood ran cold. He backed away from the door, his hands trembling. The voice came again, louder this time, the words drawn out and distorted. "You don't belong." He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt like lead. The voice faded, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then, with a deafening crash, something slammed against the door. David stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, and the room plunged into darkness. He scrambled for his flashlight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pounding on the door continued, relentless and violent. The wood groaned under the force, and David knew it wouldn't hold much longer. In a blind panic, he grabbed his keys and darted out the back door, fleeing into the woods. The forest was a maze of shadows, and David had no idea where he was going. He could hear the footsteps behind him, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. The voice followed him, echoing through the trees. "You can't escape." David ran until his legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. The footsteps stopped, and the voice fell silent. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. Summoning what little strength he had left, he stumbled toward it. The light led him to an old hunting cabin, smaller than the one he'd rented, but mercifully intact. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung in every corner. It looked like no one had been there in decades. David sank to the floor, his back against the door, and waited. Hours passed, and the footsteps never came. The voice was gone. When dawn finally broke, David ventured outside. The woods were silent, peaceful even, as if the events of the night had never happened. He made his way back to the rental cabin, half expecting it to be destroyed. But it was exactly as he'd left it. He didn't stay to investigate. He packed his things and left, not stopping until he reached the safety of the main road. Weeks later, he tried to find the ad for the cabin online, but it had disappeared. When he contacted the agency that had supposedly managed the rental, they claimed to have no record of it. David never went off the grid again, but sometimes late at night, he dreams of the cabin, of the voice, the footsteps, and every time he wakes, he checks the locks on his doors and windows, just to be sure. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life. There's something about the constant noise, the constant buzz of technology, that makes you feel disconnected from yourself. When I was younger, I read stories of people who chose to live off the grid, choosing seclusion over the demands of modern living. It sounded like peace that I desperately needed after a rough few years. I found a piece of land in the Adirondacks, a few hundred acres tucked away in a remote part of New York. It was far enough from the nearest neighbor that I'd be able to build a small cabin, live off the land, and enjoy some real solitude. I worked for months, chopping wood, digging out a foundation, and assembling a small log cabin, all while keeping in touch with the world as little as possible. I disconnected my phone, didn't rely on the internet, and lived as simply as I could. At first, it was everything I had hoped for. The mornings were peaceful, the sounds of birds greeting the dawn, and the nights were quiet except for the rustling of the wind in the trees. I felt an immense sense of peace, like I was truly living for the first time in years. There were no deadlines, no expectations, no one to answer to. It was exactly what I needed. But soon, the silence started to feel strange. At first, I thought it was just my mind adjusting to the solitude, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, that made me question whether I was really alone. The first incident occurred in the second week. It was late in the evening. The sun was dipping below the trees, and I was standing outside, getting some firewood. I wasn't paying much attention to anything except the work at hand, but then I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A voice. Low and far away. It was muffled, like someone was speaking from a distance, but there was no one else for miles. I stood frozen, straining my ears to hear more. The voice came again, barely audible, but I couldn't make out the words. I looked around, but the woods were still and empty. I assumed it was just the wind carrying sounds from further away, or maybe an animal making noise. I shook it off, but the feeling lingered. The next night, the voice returned. This time, it was louder, closer. I was inside the cabin, sitting by the fire, when I heard it again. A low murmur. I got up and walked to the door, opening it cautiously, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. The woods were thick with fog, but there was no sign of anyone. I returned inside, my heart beating a little faster than usual, but I again convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was new to living in the woods, and the sounds of nature could be unfamiliar and unsettling. But the voice came again the next night, clearer this time. It was a distinct whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. It felt wrong. It didn't sound like a voice I should be hearing in the middle of nowhere. The next day, I ventured out deeper into the woods, trying to figure out where the sounds could be coming from. I'd heard stories of people hearing strange things in the forest, murmurs, whispers, and calls that seemed too human to be from animals. Maybe there was a person nearby, someone else living in the woods who hadn't been visible to me yet. The idea of another human was comforting, even if they were living in the same remote area I had chosen. But after hours of wandering through thick trees and heavy underbrush, I didn't find anyone. No sign of a camp, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been in the area. I returned to the cabin, uneasy, but still rationalizing it all away. But that night, the knocking started. It was subtle at first, soft raps against the wooden walls of the cabin. I'd get up, walk to the door, open it, and see nothing. I assumed it was animals, maybe a bear scratching at the wood. But there were no claw marks, no traces of anything having been there. Then the knocking grew louder and more frequent. At times, it felt as though the sound was moving around the cabin, as if whatever it was knew where I was. I found myself sleeping with a flashlight and a knife by my bed. I told myself it was just the isolation playing with my senses, but a part of me was terrified. I stopped going outside after dark, not even to gather firewood, as the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. Weeks passed, and the knocks and whispers grew more frequent. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, I was sitting in front of the fire, reading, when I heard it, clear as day, someone knocking on the front door. I got up and approached it cautiously. Through the cracks in the door, I saw nothing outside. The forest was completely still. I opened the door, scanned the area, and found no sign of anyone or anything. I was beginning to lose my grip on reality. The isolation had started to twist my perception of things, and my once quiet refuge now felt like a place filled with unseen eyes. It was then that I noticed the footsteps. They were subtle at first, faint impressions in the soft dirt just outside my cabin. But after a few days, they became more distinct. Heavy, dragging steps like something, or someone, was slowly circling the cabin at night. I would hear them just outside my window, sometimes stopping directly in front of it. But when I opened the blinds, nothing was there. I tried to stay rational, even though fear gnawed at me. But then something happened that made it impossible to dismiss anymore. One night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. The wind was picking up outside, but it was the sound of something else that had me frozen with dread. A faint scratching noise, as though something was slowly dragging along the walls of the cabin. I sat up, heart racing. It was moving slowly, deliberately, around the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight, throwing off the covers, and bolted outside. The air was cold and thick with fog, but the immediate surroundings were still. No movement, no sound. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam of light only revealed the thick trees and empty air. The scratching had stopped. I went back inside, heart hammering in my chest, and locked the door behind me. I sat by the fire, shaking, my thoughts racing. I felt cornered, like whatever was out there knew how to torment me, how to make me question my sanity. I couldn't stay there any longer. But the next morning, when I tried to leave, I couldn't. My truck wouldn't start. I checked the fuel, the battery, the wiring, but everything seemed fine. My truck had worked fine the day before, but now, nothing. It was as if the world around me had suddenly turned against me. I spent the next 2 days trying to fix the truck, but nothing worked. The isolation, which had once felt liberating, was now suffocating. I had no choice but to stay, and the longer I stayed, the more the strange occurrences escalated. I began to see shadows flitting just beyond the edges of the light, figures darting between the trees. Every night the knocking continued, now followed by the faint sound of dragging steps. But the worst moment came one evening when I went to check the perimeter of the cabin before heading to bed. I stepped outside, and there, lying in the dirt just outside my door, was a pile of old brittle bones. They were human. I immediately went inside, locked the door, and grabbed what I could: my rifle, my pack, a few essentials. But as I was about to leave, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The knocking was louder than ever, and the dragging steps had returned. But this time they were inside the cabin. I heard them right behind me, slow, deliberate, dragging across the wooden floor. I left in a panic, running into the woods with no destination in mind. I didn't stop until I found a highway, and even then, I couldn't escape the sense that something was still following me. To this day, I don't know what happened there. The whispers, the knocks, the dragging footsteps, the bones, none of it makes sense. But one thing I know for sure, I'm never going back. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It started as a dream escape from the chaos of daily life. Mark, a 34-year-old freelance writer, had always loved the idea of solitude. The constant noise of the city was stifling, and when he found an online listing for a remote cabin rental deep in the forests of Montana, it felt like a sign. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no nearby neighbors, just pure isolation. It sounded perfect. The drive to the cabin took hours. The paved roads gradually turned into gravel and then to dirt, twisting deeper into a vast expanse of wilderness. By the time Mark arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the towering pines. The cabin was small and weathered but charming in a rustic way, with its wooden porch and stone chimney. He parked his SUV and stepped out, inhaling the crisp mountain air. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. The place seemed ideal, exactly as the listing had promised. Mark unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, an earthy scent, damp and old, as if the forest had seeped into the walls over the years. The interior was simple, a single room with a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There were no signs of modern amenities, just a lantern, some firewood stacked neatly in the corner, and a thick layer of dust on the shelves. The first night passed uneventfully. Mark cooked a simple meal, read by the dim light of the lantern, and fell asleep to the soothing sound of the wind outside. He woke feeling refreshed, his mind already buzzing with ideas for the novel he'd been procrastinating on. The second day, he explored the woods surrounding the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees towering so high they blocked most of the sunlight. Mark found an old trail that led to a small creek about a mile from the cabin. The water was ice cold, and the area was so serene he decided to sit there for a while, scribbling notes in his journal. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark noticed how unnervingly quiet it was. No crickets, no distant calls of animals, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against him. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of the wilderness. But later that night, as he lay in bed with the lantern extinguished, he woke to a sound. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the creaks of the old cabin. But as he lay still, holding his breath, he realized it was coming from outside. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and slow, they circled the cabin. Mark froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear. But the rhythm of the steps was wrong, too steady and too measured. The footsteps stopped near the window. Mark's bed faced the opposite wall, and he refused to turn and look, terrified of what he might see. He lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle in his body tense, until exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep. The next morning, he found nothing out of place, no footprints, no signs of any intruders. He laughed nervously at himself, embarrassed by his fear. "It's just the isolation getting to me," he muttered. Determined to shake off the unease, he spent the day chopping wood and writing, filling his time with activity to keep his mind occupied. By evening, he felt more like himself, the previous night's fear fading into a memory. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, heavier. Mark sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight he'd kept by his side. The steps circled the cabin again, pausing periodically as though whoever or whatever it was listening. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark sat frozen, staring at the door. Then a knock. Soft at first, then louder. The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, and he grabbed the hatchet he'd brought for chopping firewood. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No answer, just another knock, this one deliberate and slow. Mark couldn't take it anymore. He threw open the door, brandishing the hatchet and flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The porch was empty, the woods still and silent. But then he saw it. Just beyond the tree line, a figure stood motionless. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it seemed tall, unnaturally so, its shape distorted as though it were swaying ever so slightly. Mark's flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the figure vanished. He slammed the door shut, bolting it and pushing the small table against it for good measure. He didn't sleep that night. Sitting by the door with the hatchet in his lap, every sound sending his heart racing. The next morning, Mark decided he'd had enough. He packed his things in record time and loaded them into the car. But as he approached the driver's side door, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the metal of his SUV was a single word: leave. Mark didn't hesitate. He jumped into the car and sped down the dirt road, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, hours away from the cabin. At a diner, he sat at the counter, his hands shaking as he sipped a cup of coffee. The waitress noticed his pale complexion and asked if he was all right. "I don't know," he admitted. "I stayed in a cabin out in the woods, and something wasn't right." The waitress frowned. "What cabin?" Mark described the location, and her face paled. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That cabin's been empty for years. The last guy who stayed there disappeared. People around here say the forest doesn't like strangers." Mark left the diner without finishing his coffee. He never spoke of the cabin again, but the memory stayed with him, vivid and haunting. He never returned to the woods, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him back to civilization. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake to the sound of footsteps outside his apartment door. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Megan and Liam had always been adventurers. Tired of the constant buzz of city life, they decided to take a week-long trip completely off the grid. The idea was simple: reconnect with nature, unplug from technology, and escape from their stressful jobs. Liam had found a listing for a secluded cabin deep in the wilderness of Oregon, miles away from civilization. The photos were rustic but charming, a perfect retreat. The journey there was long and rugged. The paved roads turned into gravel paths, and eventually even those disappeared into a dirt trail barely wide enough for their Jeep. The forest grew denser, the trees taller and closer together, blocking out much of the afternoon light. Megan started feeling uneasy, but she brushed it off as pre-trip jitters. When they finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as described: a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, a wraparound porch, and a view of the thick woods. It was isolated, quiet, and surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and there was no cell service. "Peace and quiet," Liam said, grinning as he unloaded their bags. Megan smiled back, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals, not even the sound of the wind in the trees. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the eerie stillness of nature. That first night, they settled in, lighting a fire in the old stone hearth and eating dinner by candlelight. The cabin had no electricity, so they relied on flashlights and a couple of old oil lamps they found in the corner. By the time they went to bed, Megan had almost forgotten her unease. But in the middle of the night, she woke up suddenly. At first, she thought it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound like knuckles lightly rapping against wood. It came from the front of the cabin. "Liam," she whispered, nudging him awake. He mumbled groggily. "Listen." They both lay still, holding their breath. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Then it stopped, only to start again near the window. "Probably just a branch," Liam said, trying to sound confident, but his voice betrayed him. "No," Megan said, her voice shaking. "It's too precise." Liam grabbed the flashlight and walked toward the window. Megan held her breath as he pulled back the curtain. He shone the light outside but saw nothing, just the darkness of the forest. "See? It's nothing," he said, though his expression didn't match his words. They went back to bed, but Megan hardly slept. Every creak of the cabin made her jump, and she swore she could hear faint whispers just outside the walls. The next morning, they found something on the porch, a small pile of stones, carefully stacked. Megan's stomach churned. "Did you do this as a joke?" she asked Liam. "What? No, why would I do that?" he replied, his brow furrowing. They stared at the stones in silence before Liam finally brushed them aside. "It's probably just animals," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The day passed uneventfully, and Megan started to feel a little better. They hiked through the forest, cooked dinner over the fire, and watched the stars come out. But as night fell, her unease returned. The darkness around the cabin felt oppressive, like it was closing in on them. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It started at the front door, then moved around to the windows, circling the cabin. "Someone's out there," Megan whispered, clutching Liam's arm. He grabbed the flashlight and the hunting knife they'd brought for emergencies. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady but low. "No," Megan grabbed his hand. "Don't go out there." "We need to know what it is," he said, pulling away and stepping outside. Megan stood frozen by the door, her heart pounding. She listened as Liam called out into the night. "Hello, is someone there?" There was no response. Then suddenly a loud thud echoed from the side of the cabin. Megan screamed, and Liam came rushing back inside, slamming the door behind him. "What was it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," he said, his face pale. "I didn't see anything, but I swear I heard footsteps. Big ones." They barricaded the door with a chair and sat by the fire, too scared to sleep. The tapping didn't return, but the silence felt even more menacing. The next morning, they decided to leave. The trip was supposed to be relaxing, but neither of them could take another night like that. As they packed their bags, Megan noticed something else. Long scratches on the wooden beams of the cabin, deep and jagged as though made by massive claws. "Liam," she called, her voice shaking. "Look." His face tightened when he saw the marks. "We're getting out of here," he said, slinging the last bag into the Jeep. They drove down the dirt road, their eyes scanning the forest for any signs of movement. After about a mile, they saw it. A figure standing just off the path. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape seemed wrong, like it didn't quite fit into the world around it. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could feel its gaze on them. "Keep driving," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam hit the gas, and the Jeep sped past the figure. Neither of them dared to look back. When they finally reached the main road, they felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But the tension didn't leave Megan's body. She couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left whatever it was behind. Back home, they tried to move on. Liam convinced himself it was just an overactive imagination, but Megan wasn't so sure. She started waking up in the middle of the night, hearing faint tapping at their apartment window, even though they lived on the 3rd floor. One morning, Liam found another pile of stones on their doorstep. They both stared at it in silence, their hearts sinking. "What do we do?" Megan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Liam didn't answer. He didn't know. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I had always been someone who craved solitude. Living in a busy city had drained me, and after years of working long hours in an office, I decided to take a break and disconnect completely. I wanted a place where I could be alone, somewhere off the grid, with no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just peace and nature. After a little research, I found the perfect spot, a cabin deep in the mountains of Idaho, far from civilization, with no neighbors for miles. The rental was secluded, about an hour away from the nearest town, and the owner warned me that I'd need a four-wheel drive vehicle to make it there. She told me to bring everything I might need since there wouldn't be any stores nearby. I was excited. I packed up my truck, grabbed my camping gear, and made the journey, driving through narrow dirt roads until I finally arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The cabin was charming but old, with wooden beams and a stone chimney that hinted at its age. The surrounding trees towered above it, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The isolation was complete. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. The first night was peaceful. I built a fire, cooked dinner, and settled in with a book. There was no noise except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt like heaven. I felt completely at ease, knowing I could enjoy this solitude without any distractions. The sky was clear, and as night fell, I stepped outside to watch the stars. I took in a deep breath of crisp mountain air, feeling free. That evening, I went to bed early. The cabin was quiet except for the sounds of nature outside. The wind howled, but other than that, there were no other noises, no animals, no rustling in the bushes, no distant sounds of civilization. I found comfort in the silence. But that night, something changed. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to a strange noise. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the sound persisted. It was faint, like tapping, tap, 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 coming from somewhere outside. I lay still in my bed, listening. The sound was coming from the porch, just beyond the window. My heart began to race as the noise grew louder, more deliberate. I got up, walked to the window, and peeked through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkness of the forest. I scanned the area, my pulse quickening. There was no sign of anyone outside. The tapping stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. My thoughts raced. I wondered if it could have been an animal, but the tap seemed too exact, too human. I went back to bed trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, but the tapping continued intermittently throughout the night. It didn't stop until just before dawn, and I finally managed to fall asleep, exhausted. The next morning, I was on edge. I got up early, made coffee, and decided to check around the cabin to see if there were any signs of something unusual. The porch was clear, but I noticed something strange in the dirt near the edge of the porch. Footprints. Not just animal tracks, but deep human-like prints in the mud. I froze. There was no one around. I was the only person out here. No one else was supposed to be within miles of this cabin. I bent down to examine the tracks. They were large, almost too large for an ordinary person. They seemed fresh, the mud still soft. My stomach twisted as I realized they led around to the back of the cabin where the trees grew thicker. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The eerie feeling from the night before crept back over me. The tapping, the footprints. It was all too much. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with no phone signal and no way to contact anyone. I took a deep breath, tried to shake it off, and decided I would leave. I didn't want to spend another night there. But as I was about to head back to the truck, I heard something again. The tapping. It was faint, but it was definitely there. It was coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. How could it be coming from inside? There was no one there. I had checked every corner of the cabin, and the doors and windows were locked. There was no logical explanation. I slowly walked back inside and listened carefully. The sound wasn't as loud as before, but it was clear. Tap, 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 coming from the walls. I turned on every light and grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, just in case. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I checked the rooms one by one, but found nothing. The tapping continued, almost as if it were following me through the cabin. It wasn't coming from any specific place, it seemed to be everywhere. I could feel a presence, something watching me, something unseen. I was about to call the owner of the cabin, but my phone had no signal. I cursed under my breath and decided to leave immediately. I grabbed my things, slammed the door behind me, and made my way to the truck, my hands trembling. As I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure. A person standing near the edge of the trees, watching me. I slammed on the brakes and twisted in my seat, but when I turned around, the figure was gone. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. The fear that gripped me was overwhelming. I didn't know what was out there in the woods, but I didn't care to find out. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, over an hour away. I checked into a small motel, still feeling the weight of what had happened. That night, I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing the tapping sound in my head. It echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the fear I had felt. The next morning, I called the owner of the cabin. She answered right away, sounding surprised. "You didn't stay the night?" she asked, almost too casually. "I had to leave," I told her, my voice shaky. Something was there. I don't know what, but I couldn't stay. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I told you not to stay after dark," she said finally, her tone serious. "That cabin is built on old land. It's been passed down through my family for generations, and they've all had experiences there. You're not the first person to feel something like that." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? Experiences?" "There are stories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things that have happened to others. Strange noises, strange feelings. People who've gone missing in those woods. The land doesn't like it when people intrude." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was the figure I had seen in the trees, the tapping, and the footprints. "Just don't go back," she said quietly. "It's not worth it." I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are meant to be left alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I was always someone who loved the idea of being off the grid. The kind of person who thought a weekend alone in nature could clear the mind and reset the soul. I needed that kind of reset. The city had been wearing me down lately. Endless meetings, constant noise, and just the general feeling of being overwhelmed. So when I found a small, secluded cabin for rent in the Adirondacks, it seemed like the perfect escape. The listing said it was deep in the woods, no neighbors for miles, and the nearest cell tower was at least 2 hours away. It sounded like the kind of place that could give me the solitude I craved. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, eager to get away. The journey was long, taking me through winding mountain roads, eventually leading to a narrow dirt trail. The path got bumpier the farther I went, and the forest grew denser. The cabin was situated in a valley, completely surrounded by trees, with a stream running nearby. The owner had given me very little instruction on how to get there, but there was something comforting about being so far from everything. There was a small parking area near the cabin, just enough space for my car and maybe a couple more. The place was modest, an old wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a couple of windows, and a deck that overlooked the stream. As I stepped out of the car, I could immediately feel the difference in the air. It was still and quiet. The chirping of birds was almost the only sound I could hear, and even that seemed distant. The trees were so thick that the sunlight barely made it through to the ground. The isolation was complete. I set down my bags and made my way inside. The interior was simple but cozy, furnished with wooden furniture, a couple of lamps, and a few old rugs. It smelled of pine, a sharp, earthy scent. I felt a little jump of excitement. This was exactly what I needed. There was a small kitchen where I could cook, a fireplace in the main room, and a large bed in the back with an old quilt. The owner had left a note on the counter, welcoming me and warning me to be cautious of the wildlife in the area. Bears, wolves, and coyotes were common, especially at night. I could hear the creek rushing nearby, a soothing sound. I made myself comfortable and unpacked. As night began to fall, I started a fire in the hearth and prepared dinner. The warmth of the flames and the crackling sound were reassuring. The air outside was crisp, and as the darkness enveloped the cabin, I realized just how alone I was. But there was something peaceful about it, something comforting. I wasn't afraid yet. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the quiet. There were no distractions, no ringing phones or noisy neighbors. I read a bit of a book, let the fire burn low, and then headed to bed. The moment my head hit the pillow, I drifted off into a deep sleep. But at around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. It wasn't the usual kind of wakefulness where you stir and go back to sleep. This felt different. I lay still, listening. There was no wind, no rustling of branches outside, no usual noises of wildlife. In fact, everything felt eerily quiet. I sat up and listened harder. There was a noise. a faint tapping, almost like a knock on wood, coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be the house settling, as old houses sometimes do. But the tapping continued, more insistent this time, as though something was knocking on the walls. My stomach churned. I got up and grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table. Slowly, I made my way out of the bedroom and into the living room. The tapping grew louder the closer I got. I froze in the doorway, shining the flashlight around. There was nothing out of place. The fire was still burning in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. I stepped forward and the tapping stopped. I waited, breathing hard. Then, just as suddenly, the tapping started again, but this time from the window. I jumped and the flashlight flickered in my hand. There was no one outside. The window was solid, the curtains drawn tight. I didn't know what to do. I went to the door and locked it, checking that all the windows were closed tightly. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but it felt like something, or someone, was trying to get inside. I tried to shake it off and go back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house made my heart race. I felt the presence of something watching, and it made my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have finally fallen asleep, though it was restless and uneasy. The next morning I was drained. I didn't want to admit it, but the night had left me unsettled. I didn't feel safe, not entirely. I decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air and exercise would help clear my head. The woods were dense and quiet, with only the sounds of distant birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt better for a while, my nerves calming as I lost myself in the rhythm of walking. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I was met with an unexpected sight. There were footprints in the dirt, leading up to the front porch. They were fresh, the dirt still loose around them, as though someone had walked up just moments before I arrived. But there was no one in sight. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The path I had walked was the only one in the area, and I was certain no one had passed me on my hike. I looked around the cabin, the uneasy feeling creeping back up my spine. The footprints circled the porch, and I saw that they led around to the back of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. My heart began to race again. I grabbed the rifle the owner had left for emergencies, just in case, and cautiously went to investigate. But when I reached the back, there was nothing. No one. The footprints just stopped at the edge of the trees. I spent the next few hours checking the cabin, making sure everything was secure. My mind was racing. Had someone come up to the cabin while I was gone? If so, why didn't I hear anything? I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that I had been alone here for so long that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the sun set again and the shadows lengthened across the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on and the fire burning, sitting on the couch with the rifle in my lap, listening. Every creak of the wood, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept hearing faint noises, tapping again, soft whispers, but when I got up to check, there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie, overwhelming silence of the forest. The next morning I left. I packed my things in a hurry, not caring if I forgot something. I didn't want to be there anymore. I drove back down the mountain, barely looking at the cabin as I passed. The unease never left me. Even as I drove away, I felt eyes on my back, as though someone was watching me. When I returned to the city, I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I told myself it was just my nerves, the isolation, the unfamiliarity. But when I was alone in my apartment at night, I sometimes heard tapping, faint but persistent, just like I had that first night at the cabin. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me back. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I lived off the grid for 3 years in a cabin my father had built in the mountains. When I first moved there, I was searching for peace, away from people, away from the noise of the world, and away from the haunting memories that followed me after the accident. But as much as I wanted solitude, the cabin's remoteness brought more than I could handle. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The kind of place you could easily get lost in if you weren't paying attention. The trees were tall, the earth thick with pine needles and moss, and the air always smelled of damp wood and fresh snow in the winter. It had been my father's retreat, built before my time, and he had left it to me after his passing. I thought it would be the perfect place to start over, to rebuild myself after everything that happened. At first, everything was calm. I spent my days chopping firewood, gathering food from the wild, and exploring the forest around me. The only sounds I heard were the rustling of the leaves, the wind whispering through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The isolation was peaceful, but I began to feel something strange at night. It was subtle at first, just a sense that I wasn't completely alone. Sometimes I'd hear whispers from the forest, muffled voices carried by the wind. I'd convince myself it was just the trees or my imagination. But over time, it started to feel more like someone or something was watching me. It happened most when I was in bed, just before I'd fall asleep. I'd hear footsteps outside the cabin, the crunch of snow beneath boots. I'd get up, heart pounding, and peer out the window, but there was never anyone there. No tracks in the snow, nothing to explain the sounds. Eventually, I started to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or animals moving through the forest. After all, I was living off the grid. There were plenty of creatures out there, but one night, the sounds were different. I had been up late, reading by the fire, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft knock on the cabin door. It wasn't a knock that a person would make. Too quiet, too deliberate. It sounded almost as if it was being made by something not human. My pulse quickened, and I sat frozen in the chair. The knock came again, but this time there was a dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged along the porch. I stood up slowly, my breath shallow, and moved toward the door. The cabin's creaky floorboards felt like thunder beneath my feet. I reached for the handle but stopped. What if it was someone who needed help? What if it was just a neighbor from the nearest town, lost and desperate? My mind raced with possibilities, none of which made sense. I opened the door cautiously, expecting to see a person or an animal, but the porch was empty. The snow was undisturbed, the night still, but the air around me felt thick, heavy, like the weight of something watching. I stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin, and looked around. Nothing. The forest stood silent, the trees stretching up like dark, silent sentinels. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the woods. It was a voice, low, unintelligible, but unmistakable. It sounded like a person, but the words didn't make sense. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I instinctively stepped back inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, leaning against it, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I tried to dismiss it, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting through the trees, figures standing just beyond my line of sight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became, as if something was drawing nearer, something dark and malevolent. I tried to keep busy, to push the fear aside, but it became harder each night. I'd hear the footsteps again, the knocks on the door, and the whispers always coming from the woods. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. I began to feel something inside the cabin, an oppressive presence that seemed to seep into the walls, into the very air I breathed. One night, I woke up to the sound of the door rattling. The wind was howling outside, but this was different. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was as though someone or something was trying to force its way inside. My heart skipped a beat as I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the flashlight. I checked the door. It was locked tight, just as it should be. But the rattling continued, growing louder, more frantic. I aimed the flashlight through the peephole in the door and froze. There, standing in the snow just beyond the threshold, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze on me. Cold, unfeeling. The light flickered in my hand, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was gone. I threw open the door and stepped out onto the porch, but there was no footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone being there, just the endless trees and the heavy silence. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the forest. But when I finally went back inside, the air felt colder, darker. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was closing in. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could hear them clearly now, words I could almost understand. They were calling my name. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept. My nerves shot from the constant sense of dread that hung over me. I tried to leave, to pack up and drive back to town, but the road leading out of the mountains was blocked by a massive snowstorm. I was trapped, alone. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard the knock again. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, it wasn't just a knock on the door. It was a knock on the walls, the windows, the roof. The entire cabin seemed to tremble under the force of it. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound filled my head, rattling my bones. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. But it wasn't just silence, it was a void, a cold, suffocating emptiness that pressed in from all sides. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the cabin, into the snow, stumbling through the trees. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the sense of something following me, closing in. The whispers were all around me now, louder and clearer. They were right behind me. I finally collapsed, exhausted in the snow, from my body trembling. I could feel the presence now, standing over me, watching. But I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the voice. The voice I had been hearing all along, whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't have come back." I woke up hours later, alone in the snow, the storm gone, the world silent. The forest around me was still. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally stood up, the cabin was gone. The land was empty, just endless trees and snow stretching out in every direction. No sign of the cabin, no sign of anything I had ever known. I searched for days, but it was as if the cabin had never existed at all. The land was barren, untouched. There was no trace of it, no trace of me. I left the mountains and never looked back. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the whispers, calling my name. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape the thing that followed me off the grid. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a chance to get away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I'd read about the cabin online. It was located deep in the woods, miles away from any town or neighbors. The owner had made it clear that it was off the grid, meaning no electricity, no phone service, no modern distractions. It seemed like the perfect place for me to disconnect and recharge. I'd been living in the city for years, and the constant noise, the endless buzz of people, traffic, and technology had started to wear me thin. The idea of being alone in the woods, completely cut off from everything, felt like the perfect remedy. I had packed light, planning to live simply, just me and my thoughts. I didn't even bring a phone. No need for it. I drove out to the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The last stretch of the journey was a long gravel road, winding through dense woods. The air felt different out here, crisper, cleaner. I could hear birds calling and leaves rustling in the wind. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. It was small, tucked away in a grove of tall pines, its weathered wood blending into the landscape. A simple porch with a rocking chair sat out front, the kind of place where you could imagine spending hours just staring at the forest. The first night was peaceful. I unpacked, lit a small fire in the stove, and read a book. There was something incredibly comforting about the simplicity of it all. I had no internet, no one trying to get in touch with me. The only light came from the fire, and the only sounds were the crackling of the wood and the wind outside. I went to bed early, eager to make the most of the quiet, and slept deeply, wrapped in the kind of solitude I'd been craving. It was the second night that things started to change. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. My eyes snapped open, and I was instantly alert. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. It was a strange feeling, as though something had pulled me from my sleep. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight that filtered through the windows. I listened for a moment, my heart beginning to race, but I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. The wind was still outside, but there was something else, a sound. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature making noise outside. But then I heard it more clearly. A tapping sound, soft, rhythmic, coming from the wall just above my head. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but unmistakable. My first thought was that it might be the wind causing something to knock against the wall, but the sound was so consistent, so deliberate, that I didn't believe that explanation for long. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be. Maybe it was an animal or a branch scraping against the cabin, but then the tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Faster now, almost like someone was knocking at the wall. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and swung it around the room, shining it in every corner. There was nothing. The room was empty. The cabin was silent except for the tapping. I stood up and moved cautiously to the door, shining the light outside. The porch was dark, the wind howling through the trees, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No animals, no people. I stepped back inside, shutting the door behind me. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a few moments I stood frozen, listening. The cabin was still. Too still. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm myself. It was just my imagination, I thought. I'd been reading horror stories earlier in the day, so maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping resumed, louder now, more frantic. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I knew it was coming from the wall beside the bed. The same rhythmic sound. The same deliberate pattern. I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, I turned on the flashlight again and moved closer to the wall, my fingers trembling as I shone the light at it. There was nothing there. Just wood and shadows. I couldn't explain it. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive back to the nearest town. But something kept me rooted to the spot. It was like my body refused to move. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. Complete silence returned to the cabin. I don't know how long I sat there, just listening, but I eventually convinced myself that it was over. I lay back down in bed, my heart still racing. The night seemed unbearably quiet now, but I eventually drifted back to sleep, exhausted. The next morning I tried to shake it off. I went outside to get some fresh air, hoping the sunlight would make me feel better. I took a long walk through the woods, breathing deeply and reminding myself that I was just getting spooked. It was just a coincidence. Maybe it had been an animal after all. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, too empty. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept telling myself that it was just my nerves. I was alone in a cabin, miles from anyone. Of course, I'd start hearing things. The isolation was messing with my head. That night I took extra precautions. I checked the doors and windows several times before locking them. I set up a couple of candles around the cabin, even though I didn't need them for light. I just wanted something that felt familiar, something that grounded me. But even as I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 3 a.m. I woke up again, my body stiff with tension. I hadn't heard anything at first, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. I lay there for a moment, listening. Then, just as I had feared, I heard the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was coming from the corner of the room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the wind or maybe the house settling. But the sound was so deliberate, so consistent that I couldn't pretend it was anything else. I turned on the flashlight and moved slowly toward the wall, my mind racing. There was nothing there. No animals. No one. Just the same empty room. But as I stood there, my flashlight illuminating the walls, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. I looked around, confused. The windows were shut. There was no draft, and then in the dim light I saw something, a figure standing just outside the window. It wasn't clear at first. It was just a silhouette, but it was there. A person, or at least something that resembled one standing motionless just beyond the glass. My heart stopped. I stepped closer to the window, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and then it was gone. I rushed to the window and looked out into the forest, but there was no one there. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. My mind was racing now, my heart thundering in my chest. I was shaking, barely able to think straight. I turned to look back into the room, but everything was still. I left the cabin the next morning, not even bothering to pack my things properly. I just grabbed my bags, threw them in the car, and drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a hotel. The sense of relief when I finally pulled into the parking lot was overwhelming. I haven't been back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. I don't know what I saw or heard that night, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. The tapping, the figure in the window, the coldness that seemed to settle into my bones. Maybe it was all just my imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, the cabin was never as empty as I thought. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I was burned out. Life in the city had become overwhelming with constant noise, stress, and an unrelenting pace that I couldn't keep up with anymore. The decision to go off the grid seemed like an escape, a way to hit reset and disconnect from the chaos. I found a small piece of land in the backwoods of Maine, isolated, surrounded by dense forest and miles away from the nearest town. It was perfect. I spent months preparing. I researched how to live off the land, gathered tools, and built a small rustic cabin with my own hands. I made sure I had enough supplies to survive through the winter. My plan was simple. Live without electricity, no internet, and no distractions. Just me, the woods, and the elements. The first few weeks were peaceful. The quiet was unlike anything I had experienced before. I woke up each day to the sounds of birds, the wind rustling through the trees, and the occasional distant call of an animal. There was something almost sacred about it. Each night I'd sit by my fire, watch the stars, and enjoy the solitude. But as the days turned into weeks, things began to change. At first it was subtle, small things that didn't seem like much at the time. A knock on the door in the middle of the night. I opened it, only to find nothing but the dense fog that had settled over the forest. I assumed it was just an animal, a raccoon or something, and didn't think much of it. But then it happened again, and again, always around the same time, between midnight and 2 a.m., quiet knocks, soft enough to be mistaken for wind or an animal, but distinct enough to make me wonder. One night, after hearing the knocking, I opened the door with my flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the thick, still night air. My heart pounded in my chest, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the cabin. But the feeling that something wasn't right lingered. After that, the unsettling noises began to escalate. I started hearing faint whispers, barely audible, drifting through the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. These whispers sounded too human, too deliberate. I'd listen, straining to hear what they were saying, but it was always just out of reach, the words indistinct. It was around this time that I started feeling like I wasn't entirely alone. The woods were dense, dark, and full of life, but something felt different, unnatural even. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, flashes of shadow that would disappear the moment I looked directly at them. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Then came the footsteps. It was late one evening, and I had just finished my chores for the day. The sun had set and the forest had fallen quiet. I was sitting on the porch drinking some tea and watching the fireflies flicker in the air when I heard them. Slow, heavy footsteps moving through the woods, not far from the cabin. They weren't the sound of animals. They were too deliberate, too measured. I stood up, my heart racing, and listened. The footsteps were getting closer, moving toward my cabin. I grabbed the axe that I kept near the door and stepped outside, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was no one there. The woods were still, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I checked around the cabin, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbance in the underbrush, nothing. But I could still hear the footsteps, faintly echoing in my mind. It was as if someone or something had been there, close enough for me to hear but never close enough to see. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispering continued, louder now, though still unintelligible. The knocks on the door grew more frequent, and the air in the cabin seemed thick, almost oppressive. I kept the door locked, the windows shut tight. But it didn't matter. I could feel something watching me from the dark corners of the room. The next day, I decided to leave. I needed to get out, even if just for a little while. I had some food to resupply in the town nearby, so I loaded up the truck and drove through the winding, lonely roads. But when I got to town, I was greeted with strange looks from the locals. They didn't say much, but I could tell they knew something I didn't. There was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. I went into the small general store to pick up a few things, and the woman behind the counter gave me a long, appraising look before speaking. "You've been out there for a while, haven't you?" she said, her voice low. I nodded, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I'm building a cabin, getting away from it all." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You'd be smart to leave it. The land out there, it's not right. People have gone missing. Strange things happen. There's a reason no one lives out there for long." I asked her to elaborate, but she just shook her head. "Best not to ask too many questions. You'll see it for yourself." I left the store feeling unsettled. It wasn't the kind of advice I was used to hearing. I had assumed I'd find peace in isolation, but now there was a nagging doubt in my mind. Was it all just my imagination? Or was something truly wrong with that place? I returned to the cabin that evening, but as I drove up the narrow road leading to it, I felt a strange presence. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone or something was out there, watching. I parked the truck and grabbed my gear, trying to shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I opened it cautiously, but there was nothing inside. Nothing had been disturbed, except for one thing, the floor. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, large and heavy, leading from the door to the back of the cabin. I followed them, my pulse quickening. The tracks led into the woods, deep into the trees, but they didn't stop at the edge. They continued, as though whatever had left them had been waiting for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. The air felt colder, and the forest was unnervingly silent. No animal sounds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. The further I went, the more oppressive the silence became, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Then I saw it. In the clearing up ahead, a figure standing motionless. A tall, gaunt shape that seemed to absorb the light, its features indistinct but unmistakably human. My blood ran cold, and I froze. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But I could feel its presence, its gaze. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and began to walk away, vanishing into the trees as silently as it had appeared. I didn't wait around to see where it went. I turned and ran, stumbling back toward the cabin, my mind racing. The footsteps, the knocks, the whispers, it all made sense now. I wasn't alone. And whatever was out there wasn't something I could fight or reason with. I left the next morning. I didn't even pack up. I just grabbed what I could and drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I tried to go back once, a few months later, but I couldn't bring myself to drive down that road again. The land was too quiet, too still. It wasn't just the isolation that had driven me away. It was the presence in the woods, the thing that was waiting for me. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know, but I learned the hard way that some places are better left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 11.
On a fog-shrouded morning in the wilderness of northern Maine, Ella tightened the straps on her backpack, squinting at the crude map she had purchased from a roadside vendor. Her friends had told her the idea was ridiculous, venturing off-grid to reset her spirit after a messy breakup. Yet she was drawn to the promise of solitude and simplicity. The cabin she rented was listed as remote but comfortable. It took her 3 hours to hike there after leaving her car behind at an unmarked dirt trail. The place was weathered, its wooden planks warped with age. Moss clung to the roof and the porch creaked under her weight. Still, it had a certain charm, nestled in the dense forest, far from the hum of civilization. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else, an earthy musk she couldn't quite place. The cabin had a single room, sparsely furnished. A cot, a wood stove, a rickety table, and a small bookshelf filled with dusty paperbacks. A lantern and a stack of firewood sat near the stove. Ella lit the lantern as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Darkness fell fast in the woods, and with it came a profound silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant hoots of owls. She felt the isolation seeping into her bones, a mix of liberation and unease. The first night was uneventful. She woke with the sun, spent the day exploring, gathering firewood, and trying to sketch the towering trees that surrounded the cabin. It wasn't until the second night that she noticed something was off. It started with the sound, soft at first, like the faint murmur of voices. She dismissed it as the wind or her imagination. But as the hours crept by, the murmur grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was the cadence of speech, though the words were unintelligible. Ella peered out the window, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. She told herself it was the forest playing tricks on her. Still, she bolted the door and stoked the fire until it cast dancing shadows across the room. The voices continued for hours, fading just before dawn. The next day, she explored further from the cabin, hoping the daylight would ease her nerves. In a clearing, she found the remnants of an old campsite, a rusted coffee pot, a tattered blanket, and a fire ring filled with ash long since cold. Nearby, she discovered a carving on a tree. It was a symbol she didn't recognize, a jagged spiral with lines radiating outward. Something about it made her uneasy, and she quickly turned back toward the cabin. That night, the voices returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to circle the cabin, moving from one window to the next. Ella huddled on the cot, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife she'd found in a drawer. At one point, she could have sworn she heard her name. Ella. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she shouted. Her voice felt small and fragile against the oppressive darkness. The reply was silence. Then a single knock at the door. She froze. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, she crept toward the door, knife in hand. "I have a weapon," she called out, her voice trembling. The knock stopped. For a moment, she thought whoever or whatever it was had gone. But when she peeked out the window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Footprints. They started at the edge of the porch and led into the woods. But they weren't normal footprints. They were elongated, with sharp claw-like impressions where toes should have been. The rest of the night was a blur. She stayed awake, listening to the voices until they faded with the dawn. On the fourth day, she decided to leave. The solitude she had craved now felt suffocating, the forest no longer a place of peace but one of malevolence. She packed her bag and started down the trail. But after an hour of walking, she realized something was wrong. The path she had followed to the cabin was gone. Panic set in as she retraced her steps, only to find herself back at the clearing with the strange symbol. It was as if the forest was toying with her, leading her in circles. She screamed in frustration, her voice swallowed by the trees. When she returned to the cabin, exhausted and defeated, she found something waiting for her. The carving, the jagged spiral, was etched into the front door, freshly carved. That night, the voices were deafening. They were no longer outside, but inside the cabin, surrounding her. Shadows danced on the walls, shapes that didn't match the flicker of the fire. "Why are you doing this?" she cried out. The reply came not in words, but in a feeling. A deep, oppressive sadness that pressed down on her like a weight. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, and it wanted her to feel its pain. As dawn approached, she made a desperate decision. She grabbed the lantern, the knife, and her map and plunged into the woods, determined to find her way out. She didn't care if she had to walk for days. She couldn't stay there another moment. The forest seemed to close in around her. The trees gnarled and twisted as if mocking her escape. The voices followed, growing louder with each step. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows despite the growing light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. Ella ran. She didn't stop until her legs gave out, collapsing onto a rocky outcropping overlooking a river. She looked back, expecting to see the figure or hear the voices, but there was nothing. Just the forest, silent and still. She followed the river until she found a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind older man, listened to her story with a mix of concern and disbelief. That cabin, he said after a long pause, was abandoned decades ago. No one's been there since the family disappeared. Ella didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. All she wanted was to put as much distance as possible between herself and that cursed place. Even now, months later, she sometimes hears the voices when she's alone, a faint murmur on the edge of her consciousness. She wonders if she ever truly escaped, or if some part of her is still lost in those woods, trapped with whatever haunted that cabin. Story the end.